My name is Ahmad Harb. I'm the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you to Mark Lamont Hill for a very, very nice, eye-opening keynote speech, and for providing a powerful, basically, scene setter for today's conference. For those who have joined us just now, please, there are some cards on the in front of you if you have any questions for the panelists at the end of the presentations to write your name and affiliation and ask your question as legibly as possible so we can ask it to the panelists. Please also remember to silence your devices, phones and other things, and to use the conference hashtags Arab Center 2019 and Arab Media. I have the honor of sharing the stage today with a very distinguished panel, very exceptional panelists who will examine the current state of freedom of expression across the region and the role of the media and the progress toward achieving rights and freedoms for Arab citizens. We have with us this morning, in speaking order, Rami Khouri, who is a senior public policy fellow and professor of journalism and journalist in residence at the American University in Beirut. Sahar Khamis, who is associate professor of communications at University of Maryland, College Park. Muhammad Hamas al-Masri, no relation, associate professor and chair of the Media and Cultural Studies and Journalism programs at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies, and Samar Lopez, senior director of free expression programs at PEN America. Each panelist will have about 10 to 12 minutes, after which we will resume a question and answer period on those cards that I mentioned. Rami, please.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted, as always, to be here and with such a distinguished panel and a credible array of speakers and many other great people in the audience that I'm happy to interact with. And so if you'll give us, Ahmed, to give us like a 1-minute warning, just sort of
sure, yeah.
Do a dance or something, let me know. So in 10, 12 minutes, there's not much time to go into much depth, but I think to give you some main headlines about the broad trends that I've experienced. I've been now 52 years writing and working in journalism as editor, reporter, writer, doing so many different things, based in the Middle East most of the time, a few years in college in the US, but I've been working since 1968 in media, based mostly in the Arab world, and I've experienced the whole modern trajectory of what's been happening in the sphere of media and public, the public space. And I thought the title of this panel was just perfect, The Public Sphere in the Age of the New Authoritarianism. One of the points that I've made over the years is that we've never had a public sphere in the Arab world. It never existed. The political authorities or the religious or the tribal or the ideological authorities that always controlled power in our region in the modern period, say starting in the late 40s, they always controlled people so that whatever was allowed to be expressed in the public sphere reflected what the power structure wanted to be expressed. And most people went along with this. This is the intriguing thing, that if you go back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, the vast majority of people in the Arab world were not rising up in rebellions as they are today. They rose up in rebellions against Israel, against colonial control, other things. But the lives of most people in the Arab world, broadly speaking, in most countries between the 1940s and the early 1980s, their lives were improving steadily. And people were demanding more development. And you had small groups of activists, lawyers, students, human rights people, women's groups, environmental groups. You had small groups of activists who were demanding more social justice and equity and more sustainable development, but they were very small and they had limited impact. The vast majority of people went along with the developmental thrust of the modern Arab nationalist development state. What happened in the 1970s and 80s is the modern Arab developmental state turned into a modern Arab security state that was anchored in families, supported by military, and linked directly to foreign powers. So the trajectory over the last 40, 50 years, I would say, in terms of the public sphere, is that the initial phase of the regression in freedoms, expression, assembly, petition, grievances, whatever, the regression in our current situation started really in the late 40s when the first military officers took power in Iraq, and then in 52 in Egypt, and after that in other Arab countries. And it was the core constraint on the creation of a public sphere was the military control of executive government, which later controlled the judiciary and parliaments and information media and education and every other aspect of our lives. But the interesting thing is, if you go back and look at it, in the early years, say in the late 40s until the maybe 60s, essentially they were controlling people's physical bodies, where you could demonstrate in the street, what you could do physically in terms of going to vote or going to speak or doing whatever. And then the power structures were controlling essentially our hearts and our emotions with Nasser and Arab nationalism and Kulthum and Fairuz and all. There was an emotional process that was heavily guided by the power structure. And now, the dangerous thing now is that the modern Arab security state is trying to control our minds and our thoughts. They're trying to penetrate inside our thought structure and make sure that not just what we express in the public sphere, but what we think and even say in private is something that they control. And it's for that reason that I say that the single most important priority in the Arab world, and I've thought this for the last 8 or 10 years or so, the single most important priority is the preservation of an adequate space for freedom of expression, whether it's through the media or culture or education or demonstrations in the street. But individual Arab men and women need to be able to speak their mind freely and openly. And that space has been closing very steadily over the last 10, 15 years. It's really since the uprisings of 2010-11, when several of the governments in the Gulf freaked out and started applying draconian measures of mind control and thought control and arresting people for tweeting and even taking away, a few places, taking away people's citizenship for their thoughts, essentially. And of course, the worst cases you see in Egypt, where you get 50, 60,000. We don't know how many tens of thousands. Is it 40? Is it 60? But a huge number of people are in jail, mainly because of what they think, what they feel, what they believe, not because they've necessarily committed a crime. And the danger now is that you have this convergence between a tradition of autocratic, military-led, security-anchored, family-run, foreign-supported Arab governance, combined with foreign powers, and now combined with the latest technology. And this is the real danger point now, that there's a global fraternity of authoritarian digital autocrats. And these people play hardball. They don't care about the law. They don't care about personal rights. They don't care about universal declaration of anything. All they want to do is maintain their incumbency, and they want to do this now by ensuring that their citizens think the way they want them to think. Essentially, the power structure is trying to turn the Arab citizens into sheep and donkeys who basically obey orders and do their work. And then they get fed, they get water, and if needed, they get medical treatment, but they do basically the work of sheep and donkeys, that they don't think for themselves, they don't have any agency. or any rights. So that's why I say this is critical. Now, why is it critical? It's because free expression is really the foundation of every other goal that a decent society aims for: development, justice, equity, opportunity, voice, compassion, prosperity, anything you think about that a society wants to achieve, you must be able to let your citizens participate in the public discussions, not just to hold power accountable, not just to inform people, but to give the citizens a chance to do two things: to participate with ideas in how to fix the problems in society. If you look at what's going on today, Lebanon, Sudan, Algeria, all over the region, Iraq, the incredible, massive demonstrations in the streets, these are people who they know what needs to be done because they know what the problem is. Because
1 minute, Rami.
Okay, so this critical element of free expression is to allow people to contribute to the discussion about how to fix their society, but more importantly, it's about how to feel like a full human being and not to feel like an animal. So the question really over time is, as we watch the situation over time, is the trend in the last 40, 50 years has seen the militarization of the Arab state, the pauperization of the Arab citizen, and now what we're seeing is the attempt to denude the Arab mind of any kind of agency or capacity to think in itself. I want to just finish with one quote. I attended last night a very moving ceremony that was, by chance I went, some of my friends were going, so I went with them. It was the Calloway Award for Civic Courage, and they gave the award to two Americans, George Luber and John Barnett. One of them, George Luber, was the fellow at the disease control centers he's a scientist who has the most significant information on climate change and its health risks, and the administration shut him down, basically. And he told us about his experience, but he said one thing at the very end, which pertains, I think, to all of us as we look around the world and try to figure out how do we work together to confront this global fraternity of digital autocrats. He said, when they come at you with lies, always fight back with the truth, because the truth always hits back harder. And I think that's the message that I feel in the Middle East, and we see it here with whistleblowers in the United States. The truth is the only power that we actually have, and we must use it now to try to maintain this space for public discussion and citizen expression. Thank you.
Thank you, Rami. Sahar?
All right, good morning, everyone. Is the voice clear? Awesome. Thank you so much for the Arab Center in Washington for having me as a speaker in this important conference and this important panel. With the inception of the Arab Spring movements back in 2011, there was a moment of euphoria in general. People were euphoric. They said this is a moment of liberation. There is no turning back to the situation beforehand. There is no going back to autocracy and dictatorship. And that is our golden moment of liberation. And with that came also a moment of techno-euphoria, hailing the role of social media in the process of cyber activism, defined as the use of social media as a tool to bring about liberation and to push forward for socio-political transformation and change. Social media was overcredited, hailed, and celebrated as tools of liberation, mobilization, and change. So much so that we even heard terms like Egypt's Facebook revolution, Tunisia's Twitter uprising, Syria's YouTube uprising. And I always alert my students, like, wait a moment, these are just tools, they're not magic, and they cannot bring about democratization or reform or change all by themselves. When I was giving a talk at that time at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the Middle East program, and I was very much euphoric, being an Egyptian, I was like, yes, this is the golden moment for Egypt and for Arab women in general. There's no turning back. And I remember after I finished, the moderator said, Dr. Khamis, this is excellent, but don't you think you're a little bit upbeat? And I was like, no, this is the golden moment. There's no turning back. 8 years later, I'm like, yeah, I guess I was a little bit upbeat. So that is what I'm trying to talk about today, really, is this turning moment when we're really revisiting these notions of the over-crediting and over-celebration of the role of social media. We are now seeing very serious and very dangerous shifts in the so-called post-Arab Spring countries. With the unique exception of Tunisia, we are seeing very, very harsh and difficult realities. We are even seeing worse realities than what existed before 2011. We're seeing civil war in Syria, fighting and war in Yemen. We are seeing sectarian strife in Libya and a return to a much worse military dictatorship in Egypt. So what is happening here? What is happening for me as a communication scholar focusing on the role of social media and new media? We are seeing them changing from just being tools of revolution to being tools of counter-revolution, spreading counter-narratives and becoming tools of counter-revolution. Changing from being tools of spreading awareness and information to becoming tools of spreading disinformation and misinformation. From tools of liberation to tools of repression. From tools of unity and solidarity to tools of fragmentation and polarization and division. And let me just give a few concrete examples so that we are not just talking in an abstract sense. In the case of my own home country, Egypt, we saw in 2011 this glorious moment of Tahrir Square, right? This iconic moment when everybody, Christian, Muslim, Islamist, secular, men, women, rich, poor, were all united in Tahrir Square in this wonderful image. When everyone has the same message, like Mubarak must go, irhal, 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 social media become very effective tools of creating solidarity and unity. They become very effective catalysts. They speed up the process of transformation and change, and they become amplifiers. They make the message even louder, and they become effective mobilization tools. They rally people, they help in networking, in getting people out in the street and spreading the message, and getting everyone united under one banner. However, when we start to see other shifts, like what happened in Egypt in 2013, when a military takeover, ousted Egypt's first democratically elected president, President Mohamed Morsi, we saw a very deep moment of polarization and division. There was not even an agreement on a definition of what actually happened at that moment. People were divided, and they still are. Some said this is definitely the classic definition of a military coup. Others said, no, this is Egypt's second revolution. And a third group said, well, maybe it's a popularly backed coup. It's an interesting term that they coined in order to give legitimacy to the whole thing. From that moment onward, we are seeing a deepening polarization and division and fragmentation in Egypt, so much so that people are giving each other names and calling each other's names. Oh, if you are, pro-Sisi, you're a traitor. If you are pro-Morsi, you are a terrorist. And, God forbid, families are broken and divided. Some people are exiled, they cannot go back to their home countries, and there is all of this process of fragmentation. So what role does social media play here? It's a very dangerous role. Social media are weaponized in this case. They act as tools to increase the division and widen the gap and increase the polarization and the fragmentation which is already existing. How? Because everybody is going to use the social media platform as their weapon to get back at the other one. So I'm going to use my Twitter feed to attack you. You're not going to be silent, of course. You're going to use your Twitter feed to attack me back with even harsher and stronger language. And from that moment onward, we're seeing really a deterioration in terms of level of democracy and freedom in Egypt. As our colleague Rami Khouri explained, more than 60,000 political prisoners, a lot of activists, journalists, bloggers, and others are behind bars. Many are in exile, and many are killed or even forcibly disappeared. What is a very important point here to remember also is the governments building the learning curve. At the very beginning of the Arab Spring movements, we saw the activists and the protesters, the young people, having a lead. They were a few steps ahead of the regimes. They were the ones who are the change agents, the ones who are agents of change and mobilization in their country. They are the ones who were mastering the technology, being very technologically savvy, and very much taking a few steps ahead of their own respective regimes. This is not the case now in 2019 as we speak. We are seeing now a rise in the process of quote-unquote cyber wars, the tug of war between regimes and their opponents, whether they're activists, journalists, bloggers, you name it. Just like the activists and journalists and bloggers have been looking and listening and learning and improving and building their learning curves, so are the autocratic and authoritarian and repressive regimes as well. They're also pretty much improving their learning curve. And we can see many examples of that. When the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, Egypt and Tunisia were taken by surprise. Nobody had a clue what was going on. The governments were panicking. We saw the Egyptian government shutting down the internet. We call it, pulling down the kill switch for a whole week and keeping the country in a blackout and cutting down the cell phone service, which really led to a huge, economic loss. The country lost a lot of money. Now, Syria did not repeat the exact same mistakes. It was looking at learning from what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt. So it actually started to just shut down the internet on Thursday evening and Friday when people are most likely to protest, and create the Syrian Electronic Army, which is an army of hackers that really goes after the opponents and really tracks their IP addresses, shutting down their websites, blocking, hacking, and in some severe cases going after them physically, arresting them, or even killing them. So the governments are definitely building their learning curves. But is that only applicable to Arab Spring countries? Well, we can also argue that non-Arab Spring countries are trying to use repressive and authoritarian measures using their own learning curve of technological savviness and trying to learn the lesson in order to prevent the movement or the tide of the Arab Spring from reaching their own countries. We can call this preventive measures. And what can be a clearer example than the case of Saudi Arabia? Well, we see, for example, not just the arrest of many different activists, bloggers, human rights activists. We even see the paradoxical case of hailing, women's rights and talking about, yeah, we want to help women's rights. Now we're allowing women to drive. Trevor Noah said that comes after the cars are driving themselves, really. But, on one hand, there is this kind of rhetoric, and then on the other hand, we see the jailing of many different women activists who are calling for women's rights. The war on the ground is pretty much also a war online. So it's both online and on the ground at the same time. We are seeing the creation of what is called a Zubab al-Elektroni, the cyber troops or the cyber armies that go after the opponents and go after the activists for the purpose of silencing them. And of course, in some severe cases, we even saw the ultimate silencing of Jamal Khashoggi, God bless his soul, the famous Washington Post columnist and activist and journalist and speaker who was, killed in a very horrific way as a prize for his quest for freedom and for having freedom of expression and human rights in his own home country, Saudi Arabia. So what do we need to do now as academics, as people who are observing this whole situation? We need to have a deeper, more critical, and more analytical lens at looking at this whole platform and all of these shifts, transitions, and transformations. Revisit all our previous notions now. Think about how cyberspace can not just be a tool for liberation, as I said, but can also be a tool of repression, how it can get co-opted by authoritarian and autocratic regimes in power to suppress and to silence their opponents, both on the ground as well as online. We need to think about this cyberspace as cross-cutting some very important spheres, the private spheres and the public spheres. And I agree with you, there's no such thing as the Arab quote-unquote public sphere. We can only talk about multiple public spheres with a plural S. Cross-cutting the private and the public, the online and the offline. Cross-cutting gender differences, cross-cutting socioeconomic differences, cross-cutting the authoritarian and the libertarian, liberation and repression, cross-cutting all of these spheres simultaneously at the same time. That will require us to rethink again about our moment of techno-euphoria or technological determinism and think about something much more realistic. Techno-realism. Let's leave the two undesirable extremes of cyber utopianism or cyber utopia or cyber optimism that kind of overcredits and overhails and over-celebrates the role of social media, as I said at the beginning, or cyber pessimism, which says, oh, these tools are not important. Look what is happening. We have a reversal in freedom. Nothing is going to happen. We need to be in the middle ground of cyber realism, techno-realism. Assess what has happened, be proud of what has been achieved, but also be very aware of the challenges and the threats and the dangers that are happening now and the threats and the dangers ahead. Likewise, we can say the same about the Arab Spring movements. I don't think they are dead. I think they are in the ICU, in the intensive care unit, but there is still pulse. And we are seeing this pulse. We're seeing it in the region. We are seeing it in Lebanon. We're seeing it in Algeria. We're seeing it in Sudan. We're seeing it in many parts of the Arab world. So I think we just need to revive this kind of pulse and use social media realism and cyber realism as an effective tool to do so. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank the Arab Center for inviting me. Certainly, Rami and Sahar are tough acts to follow, but I'll do my best. I want to think in the brief time that I have about not just this new authoritarianism, but I want to think about the health of Arab public spheres, the health of Arab information environments, in light of authoritarianism and also in light of changing norms of professionalism, journalistic professionalism. So let me start with a theoretical point. I would say that if we want to assess the health of Arab public spheres, we have to be able to examine faithfully Arab political systems and structures. So there was a classic text written in 1956. The media scholars in the room will recognize it, The Four Theories of the Press by Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm. And there are some problems with the book. I don't want to talk about the book, but one of the overarching theses is accepted as valid, and that is that media systems are simply reflections of the larger socio-political environments in which they are situated. This is necessarily the case, okay? So if we want to understand Arab information environments, Arab media systems, and we have to look at Arab political systems and structures. And so in a lot of the research that I do, I focus on political systems and structures, and I look at political events. And I want to talk briefly today about a study that I recently co-authored about the Gulf crisis, the ongoing Arabian Gulf crisis. Let me make another point, though, first, maybe a couple of points quickly. And I'm glad that Rami and Sahar touched on this, but we need to think in terms of plural. The Arab region is not monolithic. There are a lot of differences between and among countries and media systems. This is very, very important because too often we talk about the region as though it's homogeneous and monolithic. We talk about the Arab media system, right? And that's very problematic. So let's think of a couple of examples quickly. Look at the Gulf region. You have three countries, Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, that I like to think about. They're all in the Gulf. They have a lot of similarities and overlaps in terms of how they operate politically, but there are also vast differences, both politically and in terms of their media systems. Saudi Arabia would be they would be classified according to Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm's typology. They would be classified as an authoritarian system, pretty much absolutely authoritarian. Kuwait, there's more room for political contestation. There's more openness. And as a result, the media discourse is more pluralistic in Kuwait, right? So it's a partly free media system. And then Qatar is a very interesting case because you almost have multiple systems operating in parallel in Qatar. You have a sort of a traditional Arab media model, for lack of a better term, but then you also have the Al Jazeera phenomenon, right, which is a phenomenon in and unto itself. Higher level of pluralism and diversity of opinion, debate, and higher levels of journalistic professionalism at Al Jazeera. So you see these differences in three countries that essentially neighbor one another in the Arab region. So the Arab region, talking about Arab media systems, is complicated. It's complex. It's not simple and straightforward. Think about Egypt, and like Sahar, I do a lot of my research on Egypt, and Egypt's an important country geopolitically. It also has the largest Arab media industry, right? You saw three different media systems in Egypt in just a few years. You had the Mubarak era system, media system, governed by the 1971 Constitution. I would say that it was authoritarian leaning, but certainly not absolutely authoritarian, right? Anyone who thinks that the Mubarak era was absolutely authoritarian has been in for a very rude awakening during the Sisi period, okay? So you have these two periods, the Sisi period with a new constitution, by the way, a new political system and structure, and the Mubarak period sandwiched around a period of greater opening, right? From 2011 until 2013, you had a nascent democratic order. And here I disagree with some of my colleagues, respectfully, of course, at my old university, the American University in Cairo. Some of my colleagues were writing and arguing that that period from 2011 to 2013, in their words, was an unprecedented period of repression and restrictiveness in Egypt. I could not disagree more. In fact, during that 2-year stretch where Egypt had democratic elections, there was a democratically elected president, the media discourse was much more vibrant than anything else that we've seen in Egypt. There were more than 40 political parties vying and jockeying for position in the political marketplace, and they had tables. They had seats at the table on national media and in the newspapers, and we saw this play itself out. In fact, and this rubs some people the wrong way, but I've written that I think there was too much freedom in Egypt. Yes, I know some of you are like, whoa, how can a media scholar say that? It's sacrilegious. But let me explain briefly. I was living in Egypt during this time. You had people on national television and writing columns in national newspapers quite literally calling for violence against the elected government, and also quite literally calling for a military coup. I wrote an article 7 months before the coup complaining about this, essentially, right? This was very problematic to me as a media scholar and as an American. These are things that would not be allowed in Western democratic societies, and we ended up with the military coup, didn't we, in the summer of 2013. So anyways, in Egypt we had 3 different media systems in just a few years, and I'd be happy to speak to that in the Q&A if there's time. So I want to talk briefly, I mentioned about the Gulf crisis. I recently co-authored a paper. It will be out, if anyone's interested. It'll be published in Global Media and Communication next year in 2020, one of the peer-reviewed journals. I wrote this paper with Sukaina Ajaoud, who's a former graduate student at the Doha Institute, and we looked at media coverage patterns of the Gulf crisis on or in Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. So Al Jazeera, Qatari affiliated, and Al Arabiya, Saudi affiliated. We wanted to look at the framing mechanisms. So we set up a traditional quantitative content analysis. It was driven by the framing paradigm. So we were looking at dominant frames. We were looking at directionality. We were looking at the length of news segments, how much time was devoted to different topics. We were looking at guests and sourcing and keywords and associations and other things. And I don't have time to go through the statistical data with you, but what I can tell you is that these 2 networks, perhaps unsurprisingly, presented 2 completely different pictures, 2 completely different versions of reality. If you're watching Al Arabiya, you're getting one event, and then you turn on Al Jazeera and you're like, what is, this is a completely different event, okay? And I want us to think about this, right, in a discussion like this. I want us to think about the ramifications of this polarization, this increased level of rivalry, not just in the Gulf region, but across the Arab region. Because what you've seen happen now is that nations in the region and news outlets in the region have fallen in line with one narrative or the other. They've had to take positions, and it's very polarized. It's a lot of black and white. There is not a lot of nuance. There aren't many news outlets trying to be, in the middle or play a balanced role. So this is very, very interesting, perhaps even alarming. If you look at the regional, the pan-Arab news outlets like Al-Hayat, Al-Sharq Al-Awsat, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, they've all sort of fallen in line. Even if you look at the local outlets in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Qatar, in neighboring countries, again, very polarizing media environment. And I like to think about what are the implications. And here I have more questions than I have answers, quite honestly. But what are the implications of all of this for journalistic professionalism in the Arab region? We already know prior to this crisis, prior to the Gulf crisis, the most recent version or most recent iteration of the Gulf crisis, because it's not new, Prior to this, we know that there was a crisis of professionalism, that a lot of journalists in the region see themselves as activists and advocates and extensions of political arms. So now what has happened? This has been arguably exacerbated. What are the implications for the Arab news consumer? If you're someone who's genuinely trying to find out what's going on, you know, what do you do and to whom do you turn? These are the kinds of questions that I'm interested in. And social media, people will say, well, social media. But social media is a very contaminated environment, as Sahar was alluding to, right? First of all, the governments are still the power brokers, even on social media. They're employing vast social media machinery, right? As Sahar was talking about at the end of her talk. So what is the state of the information environment in the Arab region? What is happening to norms of journalistic professionalism? Where does the Arab news consumer turn? What is going to happen when ultimately there is a truce? At some point, this conflict is going to be mediated. It might be in a year, it might be in 5 years, it might be in 20. But at some point, that's going to happen. What then does Al Jazeera do? What does Al Arabiya do? Do they go in a single night from going from attacking their avowed enemy to then saying that everything is okay and well, we were just joking, they're fine? This is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. And again, I have more questions than I have answers, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad. Summer.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and with all of these co-panelists, so thank you. I think, as the description for this session notes, there is a real contrast between two of the narratives that we're kind of seeing play out in the region right now, and I do find this framing of the public sphere, the public spheres, to be a helpful one and to think about who the players are in that and how those spheres are situated in the different contexts that we're seeing playing out, what space there is for those spheres to exist and to move forward. So touch on a couple different things. I want to talk a little bit about the protest movements that we're seeing right now and the role of social media and the press in that context. And then also, because I'm with PEN America and we're an organization of and for writers and artists and intellectuals, I want to talk a little bit about the way in which those groups are also affected right now and the way that they're targeted around the region for their expression and their role in, I think maybe we don't always think of them as part of the media structure, but I think that's an element to consider as well. So there is this one narrative, a resurgence of freedom of expression in protest movements across the region, and it is a fascinating time to have these conversations as we're looking at what has happened over the past year in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, and now in Lebanon. And I think, the Western narrative around the Arab Spring has been very oversimplified, right? That it was dead because apparently failing to dismantle decades worth of power structures in a year or two was a failure. But clearly that's not the case, right? This is a long-term process that has to happen in the region, and I think that this is an important moment for people to kind of reflect on the fact that that perspective is definitely a little oversimplified, and also that those who stand in the way of that change have always been and remain on the wrong side of history. But of course there are other narratives that are also true. There is this new authoritarianism of which Sisi and MBS are maybe the most emblematic. More brutal, more shameless, more tech savvy, as Sahar was saying, and also more emboldened, I think, in part because of our own government and our own failure to really stand up to these strongmen and certainly to hold anybody accountable for a range of actions, but perhaps most notably the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And so I think, we see certainly the way that the public sphere has shifted in those spaces where there used to be red lines that people kind of understood, things you could say or couldn't say online or in private, that have disappeared, and that those spaces are now much more constricted than they used to be. So I think in terms of these protests, I think it's very interesting, some of the things that are different about them from what we saw in 2011. First of all, in Sudan and Algeria, I think they sort of emerged outside of the capital cities. Sort of the groups who were at the forefront were a bit different than what we saw in 2011. But also, as Sahar was saying, we're also in a very different social media landscape, and the role of Facebook and Twitter in 2011. I mean, I started using Twitter because of the Arab Spring, right? Because it was the only way to know, as Mark was saying earlier, what was really happening on the ground. You couldn't read the news for that. You had to go on Twitter to hear from people directly. And that was an amazing thing. That euphoria is indeed gone, I think, and it seems like these protests are not necessarily kind of reliant on social media in the same way. But it's also just not the same sort of space that it was at that point, right? At that time, it was clear that the regimes didn't really understand this tool. It got away from them. They didn't see its potential. They didn't understand how to harness it. That's clearly very different right now. Right now, they're the ones with sophisticated surveillance technology, with armies of government-sponsored trolls to harass and smear journalists and activists, and with very well orchestrated disinformation campaigns that they're carrying out. So I very much agree that that is a space where we have to be much more realistic about both the potential and the risks. I think, you know, it's also just harder to see social media as a force for democracy really anywhere in the world these days, with much of the debates that we're having about Facebook generally. But I think particularly in a region where the governments have learned so well how to weaponize it, and where now it feels like the tech companies are the ones who are a bit on the back foot, not really able to keep up with the problems. And then I think, you know, what we're seeing right now also just kind of highlights the problems with press freedom that we see across the region and the limitations that journalists and the media face. For me, the timing is interesting to think about this question because PEN America is actually, we're literally this week putting the final touches on a report on the state of local news in the United States. And so we're thinking a lot about why the news matters for democracy. You know, and the short version about the state of local news here is that it's very bad. More to come next week. But I think, you know, the reasons why local news in the US matters are the same reasons that news matters everywhere. It is to keep the people informed, it is to hold the powerful to account, and at its best, it is to build social cohesion and underpin democracy. And, you know, without robust press freedoms, you're not really able to fulfill those functions. And I think, you know, there are certainly journalists and news outlets across the Arab world who are, despite all their constraints, being able to fulfill, I think, at least the first two of those functions, perhaps not always at scale, but there are people carrying those out. For the third one, though, I think for media to really foster social cohesion and strengthen and move forward democratic systems, I think, a bit as Mohammed was saying, you need the enabling environment for that. That doesn't kind of come out of nowhere. And so I think there are very few spaces in the Arab world where there is the potential for media to really play that role. Maybe Tunisia is certainly the best example. And I think, you know, we see that in the context of elections, right? That journalists are able to kind of push this process forward, keep this process more accountable in ways that we don't see in a lot of places in the region. So let me just speak for a few minutes about writers and artists. Attacks on journalists often garner more attention, but they are usually not alone in being targeted by authoritarians. We often see writers, novelists, poets, bloggers, singers, and visual artists also being targeted, and that's because art is powerful, right? It's another form of shaping the narrative, and it's a critical piece of free expression in any place, but particularly in a place where the powers that be are trying to control that narrative. So we also see a lot of the same tactics used against writers and artists that we do against the media. Charges of spreading false news, inciting protests, the use of terrorism and cybersecurity laws. And perhaps not surprisingly, Egypt, I'll come back to Egypt again, is one of the worst offenders on this front as well. So Sisi's government has imprisoned novelists, singers, photographers, poets. PEN America gives a Freedom to Write award every year to an imprisoned writer or artist or journalist, and a few years ago we gave it to Ahmed Naji, who's an Egyptian novelist, who was imprisoned for about a year based on the content of a novel that he wrote. A complaint was lodged by a citizen who read the novel and said that the explicit sex scenes in it raised his heartbeat, and Ahmed was sentenced to prison as a result for violating public modesty. Galal al-Bahari is a poet and a songwriter. I think he's a particularly strong example. He wrote a song, Balaha, which was sung by the exiled singer Rami Assam, and he was also at the same time writing a book of poetry, preparing to publish it, called The Finest Women on Earth, which he described as a testament to the value of women and of their good deeds in this world. He had permission to publish the book, and then his publisher pulled out from the contract at the last minute. And a few days after the song was released, right around the same time, he was arrested, disappeared for a week. When he reappeared, he showed signs of torture. He faced charges in both civilian and military courts, and in June of last year, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for insulting the military and spreading the false news with his book of poetry. And he's currently in Torah prison as a result. We've also seen similar cases in Saudi Arabia. Fahad al-Fahad, a writer arrested in 2016, was sentenced to 5 years in prison and received a lifetime ban on writing and working for the media. He was ironically charged with violating the cybercrimes law in parts for tweets that criticized the Saudi criminal justice system. Asha Fayed is a Palestinian poet and contemporary artist arrested in Saudi on the basis of the atheist content of his work and for having long hair. And he was at one point sentenced to death, although that was recently commuted to 8 years. And he's been in prison since January of 2014. And Sahar mentioned the Saudi women writers and activists who are in prison and who PEN America gave our Freedom to Write Award this year to 3 of them, Nouf Abdulaziz, Lujain Al-Hafloul, and Iman Al-Nafjan, who, as she mentioned, had all used their writing to advocate for women's rights and against the ban on driving. And I just feel, MBS is putting them in prison, subjecting them to torture at the same time as he overturns that ban is just one of these pure exertions of power, right? You don't make change. Your words don't make change. Only I make change. And Nouf and Lujain have now been in prison for over 500 days. So I think as we consider the digital technologies that may be facilitating democratic movements or empowering authoritarians, that it's important to take time to think about how much energy and effort these regimes are also putting into attacking people for their poems, for their blog posts, for their songs. These may not be as advanced, but they clearly see them as a threat, and I think there's a reason for that, right? Creativity and imagination is all that it takes to imagine a different world, and that is very much a threat to those who are deeply invested in the status quo.
Thank you. Thank you. We can take some questions from the audience, but I'm going to ask a question to the panelists. Anybody is free to pick it up. It's just, we're talking about the public sphere and the new authoritarianism. The public sphere and the new authoritarianism is, everybody is under this new authoritarianism. Social media and access to media in general is probably also a reflection of socioeconomic status. So generally speaking, urban centers are probably more exposed to media, use media, have newspapers, computers, all these things to access media. What has been the shape of this public sphere in this in the comparison between urban centers and the countryside? I mean, are there discernible differences in how people look at things? How do they look at them, and through what means? So, anybody?
I'll just make a quick comment on that. What I've observed in places like Jordan and Lebanon, where I've lived for many years, is that one of the surprising things, perhaps, is that many of the public demonstrations and the most brazen public challenge to the regimes, not challenge to overthrow them, but just to stand up to them and tell them you're doing a lousy job and you got to do better, or somebody else should replace you. Peaceful protests have come from rural areas, provincial areas, and because they were the most marginalized, they were the most discriminated against, they were the most mistreated, and rural areas. And one of the fascinating trajectories I mentioned in the developmental process in the Arab world is for the first 40, 50 years of Arab development, central governments often gave extra care to rural areas to provide them with services and give them jobs, mostly in the security services, to get them to be basic pillars of the regimes and support the regimes, or to, in places like Lebanon and other places, to support sectarian leaders because they were so dependent on them. And what happened in the last 20 years is the central government could no longer afford to keep doing that, and therefore the rural areas were the ones to suffer most when the central government pulled back from running a welfare state, and therefore they're the ones who felt most the pain of poverty and the most disappointment of being dropped like a hotcake by your government when your government could no longer give you money. So I think there's not I think there aren't, my impression is there are not major differences between rural and urban centers. The human being basically feels the same thing, behaves the same way. What is different maybe is that in urban centers people are more organized into unions and civil society groups and protest groups and special interest groups and WhatsApp groups. So people are much more organized, but that's the nature of urban society. But in terms of political sentiment and the will to express themselves and the demand to be treated like a human being and not like a donkey or a sheep, I think it's pretty much the same.
Ahmed, thank you for asking this question, because I think this has been a blind spot for a very long time. I think one of the things we need to address in the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring phase is really kind of the over-urbanization in our focus, looking at media and social media. Where is activism? The rural parts have been oftentimes overlooked and ignored, when in fact, for example, some of the strongest anti-coup protests came out in rural areas in Egypt after what happened in 2013, and there were even some peasants and rural people on donkeys holding the banner coup in English, trying to attract international media attention, but they got very little attention and very little coverage, unfortunately. The cameras are always rolling in the urban areas. When you think of the Arab Spring, you only think of Tahrir Square, and I always tell my students at the University of Maryland, yes, Tahrir Square was very important and very iconic, but guess what? It was not the only place where Arabs were going out in the streets protesting. There are so many other cities and towns and small neighborhoods, even slums and villages in Egypt that witnessed the movements and uprisings. There are so many other towns and cities in other Arab countries. Look at Sidi Bouzid, this small town that ignited the whole flames of the Arab Spring, right, literally and metaphorically, that very, very, very few people knew anything about. Also, when the whistleblower Muhammad Ali, the 45-year-old contractor and businessman, started to talk about having protests in Egypt, and that started to have some trickle-down effect to the street, maybe not on a large magnitude, but it was described by outlets like Washington Post and New York Times as rare and shocking protests that are very meaningful and important. Some of these protests happened in rural areas. In fact, they happened in Upper Egypt, places like Qida, Sohag. Some of these areas in rural Egypt and in upper rural Egypt, for two reasons. Number one, as Rami mentioned, neglected and have less socioeconomic share, they have less of the pie, so to speak. Their share is very limited in terms of services, in terms of economic resources, and also there is less, police presence on the streets, which is more tense and intense in urban areas like Tahrir Square and in the streets of Cairo. So these two reasons, less economic resources and less police presence, really kind of encouraged people to go out in the streets more in rural areas and in Upper Egypt. Did it get enough media attention? Again, the answer is no. So I think that's a blind spot that we really need to address.
Thank you. Mohammed, you want to comment?
I'm good.
You're good. You? No, okay. All right, I have quite a few questions here. I'll start with Rami on the other side. Many questions about what you said and about general other things. For instance, what is he? Hamid from the Egyptian Arab, what is it? I'm sorry, Egyptian American Relations Council says that with people moving places of employment, journalists hopping from one job to another. Sometimes they probably do not have exactly what they're basically insecure of in their position, in their job position. How can they really reflect reality the way it's supposed to be reflected? So basically, we're talking about the socioeconomic status of the journalists themselves, of the media people.
My experience in media organizations in the Arab world for all these decades is that for the most part, with some exceptions, for the most part, the best people don't go into journalism, unfortunately, because it has always been a domain that was totally dominated by the government, has to be licensed by the government, and the government creates the laws that allow it to work or not to work. Everything is government controlled. So if you're going to go into the media in the Arab world, essentially you're going to be an apparatchik for the government. And most people didn't mind doing that at one point because the media was, in the 60s and 70s, the media was doing some pretty lively stuff in many Arab countries. So it wasn't always, authoritarian repression, but it was controlled. And in many cases, the media was not just licensed, but financed by the government or owned by the government. And that's increased now much, much more. So now, a lot of the media in the Arab world are Saudi or Emirati owned or indirectly owned or controlled. So the profession of journalism attracted either hardcore political activists, and somebody, I think, Muhammad mentioned that a lot of the journalists were activists, actually masquerading as journalists, but they were in there for a political cause, as is the case in many journalists here in the Western world. It's the nature of journalism. But the reality is that you can't expect Arab journalists in Arab countries to do serious journalism for the most part. There are exceptions, and there are people, including we have Daoud Kuttab with us, and we have others here who do serious journalism on the internet and community radio. So you can do, some people do investigative journalism, but these are pockets, and they're based on individual, courageous, honest journalists who insist on staying in the Arab world and trying to do their job there. Jamal Khashoggi and I often talked about these things because he worked in the Gulf, I worked in Lebanon and Jordan, and we both had the same sense that we want to stay in the Arab world, we want to be journalists, we want to try to do the best we can, and we know there's limits, we work with the limits, but we try to work from within inside to push the limits as much as we can. And so you have people all over the region who try to be as professional as they can, but today it's very, very difficult because of the polarization and the financial controls. This is going to change eventually. Social media has opened whole new opportunities for self-expression. It has not yet created significant new structural media organizations in the way that it has in the Western world, where if you look at the digital media, you have incredible institutionalized quality journalism, most of it progressive on the left, but even you have some people on the right, but these are strong, active, influential media or institutions that are digital. That's starting to happen very, very slowly in the Arab world, and the problem is that the best journalists have to go overseas, and for the most part, again, there's always exceptions, but the exceptions are very, very limited.
Thank you. This question is from Wafa Hallam from Inside Arabia to Sahar. Where do Arab women stand, and to what degree have they impacted the political process? Was their participation in protests and activism significant or only marginal?
Right, I'll try to
Very
answer this
direct
as
question.
briefly as I can. It's a very important topic, dear and near to my heart. And one of the things I did not talk about, earlier in my, talk, because in the interest of time, is cyber feminism. This process of how women are creating this sister term. We talked about cyber activism in general. Cyber feminism is when women actually use social media to advance their own causes which are important for them. And I always say women have a dual struggle. Yes, they have the political struggle alongside men to try to shake authoritarian regimes and repressive regimes and dictatorships, but they have a parallel struggle, which is trying to shake the societal mindset that has been very unfavorable to women in many parts of the world, especially in many parts of the Arab world, because of a number of reasons: stagnant traditions and patriarchal culture, negative mindset, around women and all of that stuff. many of which, by the way, has been blamed on Islam, but in fact, it has been because of societal and cultural factors, and I totally agree that we cannot separate all of these factors from the overall and overarching socioeconomic, political structure and context in these different societies. Having said that, we have to see a very clear fact here. Women are on the front lines of resistance when it comes to things like the Arab Spring movements. They were in the front lines of resistance, putting their own lives at risk, taking bullets, being arrested, being harassed, being raped, and even being killed, right? And then once you have a movement is over, in whichever way, they're told, thank you so much, ladies, it's time to go back to the kitchen. You can go to the hair salon and do your nails. Somehow they're marginalized and they're pushed to the side. And we've seen that in Egypt when women, after the ousting of Mubarak, thought, this is our golden moment, let's have a 1 million women march in Tahrir Square on International Women's Day. Only 500 women showed up, and they were negatively chanted at. They were told, this is not the time for this. Let's focus on building the country economically and politically. This is not the time for quote-unquote women's issues. So really, this is a very dangerous phenomenon, and I hope women will learn the lesson that when you are putting your own life at risk and you are in the front lines of resistance, you should never allow yourself and allow others to marginalize you or to push you aside and just say, oh, women's issues are not now important or relevant. Women are half of society, and they give birth to the second half. So if we push them aside and say this is not... Thank you. If we push them aside and say this is not the time for women's issues, what you are doing is you're doing something very detrimental and very dangerous and very negative to the overall improvement and welfare of society as a whole. And therefore, we really saw the only country that emerged out of the Arab Spring with somehow good results and positive results, Tunisia, right? Unsurprisingly, that's also the case where women have the best education, more than 90% literacy rate. Women are highly educated. They also are on the bench. They are judges, and they are at the table. And I always say, if you are at the table, you will not be on the menu. And this is very important. Women have been on the menu for a very long time. It's time for them to be on the bench. It's time for them to be at the table. It's time for them to be decision makers. And that can never be divorced from the overall socioeconomic and political context. If you see a repression and going back to autocracy and dictatorship, as we have seen in the rest of the so-called quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, that will definitely negatively impact women's agenda and women's rights. There will also be a backlash in women's activism. Many of them are going to be jailed, arrested, harassed, exiled, and we have seen that in the quote-unquote post-Arab Spring countries, with the exception of Tunisia. Again, is that surprising? No, because Tunisia is the one country that was able to really kind of save its democratic experiment and was able to create a safe and smooth transition to democracy. We have seen their wonderful, free and transparent elections recently. So again, that's where you have more empowerment for women, because women are part and parcel of the overall socioeconomic and political context. We can never detach one from the other.
Thank you very much, Sahar. This question is for Mohammed Al-Masri from Nick I think it's Benavista from Center for International Media Assistance. Can journalistic professionalism be addressed in the region under current patterns of media outlet ownership?
The short answer is no.
No.
Well, let me give you a longer answer. I said at the beginning of my talk that media systems are inextricably linked with political systems and structures. So what's going to happen in the Arab region is that there's going to have to be a serious democratic reform movement. And yes, ownership structures are going to have to change. Right now, the overwhelming majority of news outlets in the region are owned by the government. And a lot of those that aren't owned by the government are owned by government-friendly business people, okay? I mean, like, people talk about the liberalization of certain governments who've granted, private newspaper licenses to business people. But the problem is that they only grant those licenses to certain people, right? Those that are friendly with the regime. So, it's a major challenge. It's a major problem. And again, nothing is going to change, at least not substantively, until there's a more serious and sustained democratic push. And I go back to Egypt, as an example. I mean, right after the revolution in 2011, and I talked about that opening, that brief 2-year opening, but that's what happened. All of a sudden you had, people, private people owning, all these news networks just popped up out of nowhere. And so you had this very vibrant and sometimes chaotic discourse, media discourse. At one level, it was very healthy. And then, at another level, as I kind of alluded to in my talk, it wasn't the healthiest, form of discourse. But yeah, that's one major, ownership is one major challenge, but there are many other challenges. Ownership is but one variable.
Okay, this question is from Michael Hudson, and any or all, so I'm going to give it to Summer and put her on the spot. Please discuss Saudi Arabia's role in shaping the media environment throughout the Arab world and beyond.
Well, I might let others speak to that as well, but I guess I will talk about, one angle on it, which I do think is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So I think obviously there are sort of like ownership questions, which maybe Mohammed can speak to as well, but I think that, the implications of that, there's so many reasons that this particular murder, I think, has sort of captured people's attention in a way that many others do not, and partially just the brutality of it, the sort of arrogance of carrying it out in the way that they did. But I think also the way in which it sort of reached outside even of Saudi's borders and said, this dissenting voice is unacceptable, and we will silence it wherever it is. And so I think that has implications that, certainly go beyond Saudi Arabia and affect freedom of expression and press freedom both across the region, but also globally. I think that now there are people in exile and journalists who may have gone, elsewhere in the world to gain professionalism or to seek other opportunities, or in exile because of the things they wanted to say and cover, who no longer feel safe, and in ways that they might have a few years ago. So I think that that particular act has many long-term consequences, and I think this is a broader trend that we're seeing of these sort of extrajudicial, extraterritorial attacks on journalists and dissidents, not just from Saudi, but from China, from other countries, other authoritarian states as well, from Russia. And I think that as we see that as an increasing trend, it has vast consequences for press freedom globally.
Can I chime in really
please.
quickly? I want to answer that in a little bit of a different way. I agree with everything Samar said. But I think one of the interesting things is that in terms of, if we talk about Saudi power or Egyptian power for that matter, or Emirati power, one of the interesting things that we've seen play out over the last couple of years is that these governments, all of these repressive governments, are learning important lessons about the limits to their power. So the Saudis never expected to get the kind of to receive the kind of international outcry that they've received after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. They didn't expect this international media blitz. They didn't expect all these scathing human rights reports. They didn't expect the reaction of the Turkish government or other governments, many in the West, in Europe, even the United States. They didn't expect all the critical media coverage. The Sisi government, I talked about Egypt, they have everything on lockdown inside of their country, but they're learning that they can't control what goes on outside of their country. So Muhammad Ali, who Sahar mentioned, here's this whistleblower, he's in Spain, and he's in the midst, I think, of bringing down the Sisi government. I mean, it might take a few years, but I think we're witnessing the beginning of the end of the Sisi government. And Sisi's very, Sisi is terrified. Sisi, maybe my prediction will be wrong, but I'm not wrong about that. The Sisi government is terrified. I could go through a long list of things that they've done, and confident, strong, stable leaders don't do those things. Scared leaders do those things. So that is significant. Sisi did an interview on CBS News I guess this was about a year ago. Don't ask me why he agreed to do an interview on 60 Minutes. I mean, it's an absurd. Yeah. I'm not an advisor to authoritarian governments, but if I was, I would not advise him to go on 60 Minutes. But it was a disaster. I don't know if you watched the interview, but it was a disaster. The man is sweating. It was horrible. And then after the interview, the Egyptian regime called CBS on the telephone and said, we don't want you to air the interview. They don't understand how it works. They don't understand. So they're learning about the limits of their power. They can control public opinion. They can manufacture opinion polling data and prevent Western governments from, or Western, I should say, polling organizations like Pew and Zogby from going into Egypt and carrying out polls. They can do that. They can manufacture opinion polling results, but they can't control what goes on outside of Egypt. And so they're learning important lessons, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis, about the limits of their power.
Okay, thank you. This question is from Dan Lieberman, alternativeinsight.com. Do economic wants, it's not directed to any specific person, do economic wants come before political imperatives? If so, was the Arab Spring doomed to fail because it could not quickly satisfy economic wants?
Who's this for?
Anybody?
Can I mention?
Who's the economist here?
It's clear from the modern history of the Arab world that basic human needs, socioeconomic, life-sustaining needs, come before political issues: water, housing, education, healthcare, food. And so people in the Arab countries, as they did in many other countries in East Asia, would sacrifice political rights for basic quality of life issues. And this is why in the Arab world from the 1930s till recently, we didn't have huge popular uprisings against the internal government. There was one or two against Numeiri in Sudan. You had some in Iraq against Saddam because of the Kurdish and Shia repression. They rebelled against him. But broadly speaking, the kind of revolutionary street uprisings that we've seen in the last 8 years in the Arab world are a new phenomenon in terms of being directed internally. And that's because in all the previous 70 or 80 years of Arab national development, most Arab families felt that their lives were improving and their kids were going to have better lives as well. That stopped around 1990 or so, and that's why you've seen a lot of these internal issues. So I think it's very clear that people basically just want to be treated as human beings with basic rights and opportunities, not to be constrained in what they can speak or read or travel, and they're not. Most people are not particularly ideological. They just want to live a normal, decent life. But when their government constrains them and treats them like animals, they push back. But so I would say clearly that socioeconomic needs are a priority for all human beings over political issues. But there's a point, and the World Bank and others did studies from the East Asian experience, that why did South Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia and Indonesia and all these people put up with authoritarian, autocratic regimes for so many years without pushing back? And they found that basically there was a combination of reasons, but one of them was that basic human needs came first. But when people reached a certain level where their needs were satisfied, basic human needs, and that came with about a per capita GDP for around $6,000 back then. Once people reached that level that their needs were met, then they started asking for political rights. And this is it's a universal human reality.
Very briefly, sorry. Sorry.
Ladies first.
Very briefly, I'm not an economist with any stretch of imagination, but I just have a yes and no answer to Imad's question, because really what we saw in the Arab Spring was the slogan عيش حرية عدالة اجتماعية, bread, freedom, and social justice, right? So a lot of people wrote at the time saying, oh, whoever thinks that the Arab Spring is just about bread, it's just about food, just about, the economy, they're mistaken, because people also want dignity. People want social justice. People want to be heard. They want to be respected. They want to be recognized. And all of these are also equally important needs that need to be acknowledged and taken into consideration. So we don't want to, overstate or understate the importance of the economy and importance of socioeconomic needs, which are, as Rami just explained, are very important and very vital to every society and every human being, not just quote-unquote Arab societies or Arabs. But we also don't want to overshadow or underestimate the importance of other valid and legitimate demands for justice, for dignity, for freedom, and for respect.
Go ahead.
Can I just chime in really quickly? So one of the reasons why, as Sahar is alluding to, one of the reasons why Arabs went out into the street in 2010 and 2011 was for economic reasons. They knew that if they could bring about a political change, that their economic fortunes would change for the better, right? And one of the, I'm not an economist, but I know a lot of economists, and they've taught me that authoritarianism breeds corruption, okay? And so it's no surprise that in the Arab region we find some of the most politically repressive authoritarian governments in the world, and also we find some of the most prolific violators of the just basic economic norms in the world, the highest levels of corruption in the world, in the Arab region. If you look at things like the corruption perception index, right? So if the political landscape changes, then the wealth can be more easily more fairly distributed. We talk about the wealth gap in the United States. Look at the wealth gap in a place like Egypt. It's massive. I've never seen so many Mercedes-Benzes in my life as I have in Cairo, and I've never seen so many people living in the streets, living in the graveyards, eating out of the garbage as I have in Cairo.
Can I just add?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I would just agree with that. I think it's a fallacy that you can separate these things out, right? The economic systems and the political systems are inextricably connected in these countries and in all countries. And so in terms of thinking about solutions, you can't change the economic situation of people until you address the political system too.
Thank you. I think we're coming close to the end here, but I do want to ask this question to Sahar Khamis from Dr. Ghassan Boudiab. How do you see the upcoming juncture in Lebanon, given the current protests, and what do you say about the coverage the Lebanese TV channels are doing?
I think that any observer of Lebanon, in my opinion, my own, and every human being has their own subjectivity, but I'm very impressed with what the Lebanese people are doing. I'm very impressed with the mobilization on the street. I'm very impressed with the overall, international attention that has been paid to Lebanon and to the mobilization of people on the street. And one only hopes that with such movements as we are seeing in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Sudan, in Iraq, these kind of protests on the street and this kind of public mobilization will have a trickle-down effect to other post-Arab Spring countries that did not have a fortunate outcome, as I mentioned earlier, with the exception of Tunisia. Because I have the mic, let me just very quickly say something which is very important I did not mention in my talk, which is really one of the most important limitations of the role of media and the role of social media in particular, is they cannot fill the power vacuum. If you have a power vacuum in a society that's not filled with actual civic engagement and on-the-street activism, social media cannot be magic. It's not a magical tool. It will not be able to fill this kind of vacuum. It's easy to oust a dictator from office. It's very difficult to figure out what to do next. And we learned this lesson the hard way, just observing what happened, the detours and the reversals and the backlashes and setbacks in the so-called post-Arab Spring countries. The social media was not able to fill some of these power vacuums or to fill some of these gaps. It was not able to create, quote-unquote, actual civic engagement, meaning actual engagement in organizations, NGOs, political parties. These need an overall socioeconomic and political structure and transformation in societies, and it cannot create a sufficient trickle-down effect if you have the absence of public opinion leaders, as we have seen in the limited protests that took place in Egypt last month, September 2019. The fact that the government acted very quickly to arrest more than 3,000 people, many of whom are activists, bloggers, human rights activists, journalists, you name it, across the board. The fact that these public opinion leaders are either behind bar, in jail, in exile, or killed, or forcibly disappeared, means that you cannot have a sufficient trickle-down effect to actually create a sufficient mass mobilization. So I hope that the experience of Lebanon and other countries that are witnessing these waves of change and protest now will kind of really learn the lesson and fill some of these gaps to create a successful example that other countries can emulate.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for a very, very nice, for attending a very, very nice panel. Really, we had a lot of thoughts here, and this is a very, very good introduction to the lunch conversation that is silencing the truth, the case of Jamal Khashoggi. and 2 other panels in the afternoon. Please join us for lunch next door, and thank you very much for being here.